Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode number 60 of Relating to DevSecOps, where we explore the development, security, and operational issues of today so that we can solve real world problems with people that face them. Mike and I have a very special episode for you all today, talking about one of the pillars of DevSecOps that we really talk about between collaboration and your mindset. It is what everyone thinks of when they think of DevOps and DevSecOps. It is security automation. But I think we want to take a little bit of a programmatic, systematic approach to this as we talk to each other. We had a little bit of a discussion early on to talk about security automation. So, Mike, welcome back, my wonderful co-host. How are you doing today, this evening in 2023, as we face the wildfires of Canada?
Yes. Canada needs to leave us alone, okay? They're supposed to be our hat, not all this mess.
Yeah. I mean, they say just blame Canada these days, and today we actually can.
Yes.
Hope everyone is safe and breathing well today. Not what we're here to talk about, but obviously just getting a little bit of the modern times, trying to keep it current events up in here. I'm also a bit loopy today. It's been a long week. How are you doing?
There's a lack of oxygen in New York, I think. So
I think
probably
so.
is probably affecting your ability to speak.
Uh-huh.
Good
It's
time
true.
to host a podcast.
Yes, a perfect time. So security automation, Mike. We talk about it a lot, and people fail, they succeed, baby. They have different opinions of it. How do you look at or define security automation specific to let's focus on application and cloud security, because that's mostly what we're looking at when we're talking about DevSecOps. How do you look at security automation, or how do you get your mind into the right frame?
I mean, I think it's anything. I think it goes back to the struggle of we're always a smaller security team than we are a DevOps team or a development team or a whatever it is, IT team, whatever you have in your company. So we're always a smaller security team responsible for a lot more systems and code and people to secure. So we always have to find ways to automate things. And yeah, I think that's been a huge focus of DevSecOps, obviously plugging into the DevOps pipelines and kind of whole process and automating things and making it scalable. So that's where my mind goes when we talk about automation. But obviously there's a whole host of things you can automate. The saying is automate the dumb stuff. So people try to do that the best they can. I think the industry hype is definitely like automate all of your testing.
Yeah. So you're really thinking about the why. Basically, why do I automate? What is it going to give me? And you're sort of talking about the thought process folks go through to say, we have a small team, we need to do something to scale ourselves or enhance ourselves in the face of not being able to hire or not having the budget to hire. That's a good one. I think that you're right. I think that there's an eye towards automation for that reason, and I think that my reason why is really similar, but it's more to keep up with the rest of the organization. I think that it's more like not necessarily how do we scale, because when you think about scaling, it's more like enhancement of capabilities. How do we grow or make ourselves better, which I think is part of it. But I think that automation really comes out of almost jealousy of the engineering teams and their ability to automate the things that they do in the build pipeline and CI/CD, and trying to figure out what we can do to be a part of that.
Yeah, they do. They have all the cool toys, and we're over here clicking scan and emailing
Yeah, exactly.
emailing PDFs around.
Yeah. So in that vein, I think the idea for this episode, for folks listening, is to really talk about what are the dream areas that practitioners, developers, engineers really think of when they think about automation, and that can come in a couple of different flavors. One is, what do they begin with? What's their first automation? And then what do they think they're going to get to at some point in the future? And Mike and I came up with this list, so we'll just sort of go down the list, see how far we get. Starting with, I think the one that we both agree is the top thing that comes up in most folks' minds, which is scanning or testing, which you mentioned just earlier in this episode. So Mike, when folks think about testing, what do you commonly see or think about even yourself when it comes to, hey, I'm a security team, I'm in this world of DevSecOps, I want to automate my scans? Where does your head go?
I mean, so there's like the common industry thought process, I think, and what the booths will sell you at security conferences and tech conferences. There's SAST and DAST, so static analysis and dynamic analysis, aka scanners. I think that's like the traditional thought process, traditional areas of testing automation that people think about. I think we definitely got into a smarter place than that, but that's still kind of the traditional view. My thought, if I had if I was in control of a testing strategy in an automated way, I think I'd probably focus on SAST and focus on really high fidelity testing. And I feel like we'll probably talk about this, but that's where things have been moving to, is less of these huge tools and moving to more of these high fidelity types of tests. So that's kind of where my thought process goes, is the traditional industry standards for what you should do, and then what's actually being done and what probably should be done moving forward.
So let's dig into that a little bit. So the tools that you're being sold, let's just focus on SAST, static analysis for the time being. We could probably dip our toes into software composition analysis in that regard, because I think that comes up a lot as well in the DevSecOps conversations, because the advertising really is integrates into your DevSecOps process, integrates into CI/CD, automatic scanning, automatic testing.
Yeah.
And I think that on the surface, it's usually we kick off the scan automatically with your build. Basically, at the end of your build, we hit the scan button for you. Right?
Yeah.
And, I think that the common theme that I see in those types of scans is that the automation is automating a process that already doesn't fit into the engineering pipeline, right? So I think if we break this conversation down into failures, successes, and like what we should maybe do, or what the industry says, I think the big failure always is automating more than likely what you currently have. Would you agree with that?
You mean in the sense of like automating something or forcing people to do something that's not part of their actual normal process?
Yeah, like basically, no, I'm saying automating something that is currently part of their process without thinking through, should that thing actually be automated? Yeah. So I think the failure for me is that I'm always seeing is, hey, I'm going to automate SAST. My tool supports it. I'm just going to, install the plugin in Jenkins, or I'm going to install or integrate with my GitHub pipeline, and it's just going to run the scan that I've already got. And I think that right now there's no analysis, or I don't see a lot of analysis happen in terms of should that have been automated in the first place. And so I think that that's the biggest failure in SAST that I see, and so that's sort of what I'm asking. Are you seeing the same thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think not to blame industry again. We'll just blame they. They always say that you should be integrating these tools into your pipelines, like you said. So just slap it in your pipeline, give developers the feedback, break the build, whatever. So to your point, people are just kind of following the prescription of what even the tool vendors are going to say. Like that's their view of how you should use these tools. Is just throw it into the pipeline, make it a breaking step in a pipeline, and force developers to fix things. So I agree with you. Like that's if a vendor's documentation is saying to do it a certain way, you probably should take a step back and rethink about what you're doing and think about your culture before shoving a tool in there. But yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, in those cases, what happens, right? What's the output? The output is something that a security practitioner has to analyze in order to be effective for engineering teams, or the engineering teams are going to have to filter the results down, because we know that SaaS tools are typically plagued with false positives. And that sort of brings up a point that we talked about previously, is that most of the time we have two major problems with SaaS in a traditional sense. One is it's all manual scanning, and two, that it's really slow and cumbersome and takes hours or longer periods of time than what is in the CI/CD pipeline. So there's an attempt to reduce the time it takes to scan. And the other bit is the amount of false positives, and then the manual handling of all of those issues, and then getting those over to the engineering team to remediate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of touch on it. The big thing that with all these tools basically is they are generally tools meant for security practitioners who have some context of the issue, and they just, the guidance, the description of the issues and the guidance is usually pretty bad. And that's been true for pretty much all the tools. So
Yep.
throwing a heavy tool that takes, it could take days to complete. So if you put it into everyone's pipeline and said, all right, you can deploy in 3 days after this scan is done, like, yeah, that's not going to work with a real DevOps culture. And then for the findings to be just like kind of garbage that people don't understand, plus false positives, plus it's going to print a PDF versus like have nice JSON output into your pipeline. So yeah, I think it goes back to your point of, should you be doing it in the first place?
Yeah. Because when you automate those processes, you automate everything around it too, right? So it's like, if you're kicking off the scan, you're automating that thing. Like, what is that? Does that actually save you any time or work? And so I think that for me, before we get into the rest of these, I think the important thing that I want to convey in the automation bit was a realization that I came to probably like a month ago, in terms of what things can I use to evaluate what I can actually automate effectively. And I had recently put a talk together in terms of talking, and in that talk I was trying to figure out what are some other things that are automated in the world, and I came across like navigation and autopilot systems and things like that. And one of the ways that they described it is the automation of precise and consistent and repeatable processes free up engineers in these other systems like mission control for NASA or whatever to focus on the problems that require critical thinking and problem solving. It frees them up to be able to decide how to navigate, or to monitor other systems, or to understand if something is wrong, because these autopiloting systems are handling all of the things that are precise, repeatable, and consistent. And I thought that was a really great way to think about automation in DevSecOps, because if you look at a SAST scan and the fact that we're always failing at doing this, it's because there isn't consistency to the results, even though, and it's not a very precise function, even though it is repeatable. So just because we have a repetitive process doesn't necessarily mean that we need to automate it. It needs those other two elements of preciseness, accuracy, and consistency, meaning that we know that it's going to start and finish and do the same thing every single time, and provide an expected result that we can actually action on. What do you think about that?
No, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I agree. If you keep repeating, if you automate a repeatable process that just is imprecise, yeah, you're gonna scale, but you're gonna fail. Oh man, I gotta coin that. That's trademark. Man. That's patent pending. That's patent
right
pending
there.
right there.
I think that's the title right there. I think we just hit the title jackpot.
I'll send you the licensing agreement for that.
Okay. Yeah. Use a little TM.
Yeah.
Little trademark. Yeah. No. I agree. Yeah, obviously, because I just said it. But but I think So what I want to do is sort of go through, maybe we'll finish SaaS and then go through these other things and try to line them up to that element and figure out why this fails a lot or sometimes and see and sort of test this theory a little bit in terms of what we've seen in our day to day. So for SaaS, I think, if we turn it on its head and we think about, well, how do we make it precise? How do we make it we know that it's repeatable. How do we make it precise? And then how do we make it consistent? Some of the things that I've suggested or talk about is making more accurate security tests. So talking about sort of security integration testing, or making automating the things that are accurate. So turning on the rules that are very accurate in your code base, or that are, maybe you've already established a baseline, so it's just going to be a delta. It's like, hey, we've gone through everything and we've implemented input validation. So we know if we get an input validation finding, it's going to be actionable, right? So it should pass every single time, right? It shouldn't fail, something like that. So if it's consistent and it's accurate and it's precise and it's repeatable, I think that's a good candidate for automation and SaaS. I think you brought up the idea of it being fast, which is I think what most folks think of when we are going after automation, and I think that the vendors go after, because they're like, if I make it faster, then I can be as fast as an engineering team. But my challenge to you is, if it's fast and still doesn't have this preciseness and this repeatability aspect, is it going to work?
No.
Okay.
not a hard challenge. Fast.
So let's
crap,
talk about it. Yeah.
Fast crap is still crap.
Well, it might not be crap, but I think, we talk about SemGrep as being something really good, and I love SemGrep. But I don't know, like if I just swapped SemGrep for, one of the big boxes, name a few, Veracode, Checkmarks, all these, is it going to, like, some folks are coming into this with like, this is going to solve my problem because it's faster, it's more accurate. So do you see that as a path, or do you think that folks are still going to have to go through the same exercises that they would with these other tools?
No, I mean, I agree with you. If you swap out one of the big vendors, the slower vendors, for SemGrep, your builds will run faster and you'll get your findings back. But again, you're going to have some false positives. You're going to have some findings that are not applicable to your use cases, either just false positives or they're just not contextually accurate for you. And so you'll still have some of those other issues. I guess the one good thing about that is a developer's probably going to be a little less pissed off if they get a false positive after 30 seconds of a scan versus 3 days of a scan. But but I agree with your overall point of it can't just be fast; it has to do more than just that. But I do think it is an important principle to focus on, because if you're doing one thing solely for one group, you're never going to be able to cover everything for everyone, which is not really realistic. But that's our goal, to try to cover as much of the organization as possible. Yeah. So I do think it should be one of your principles, but not your only principle.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that speed is a factor, but in my eyes, speed is basically the last thing that comes into play, because if you are fast and you are not consistent, then you are still slowing down the process. So you may have gotten a little bit faster, but you haven't solved any of the problems. And in reality, you may be missing a lot, because some of the things that you get out of these more comprehensive tools are either more difficult to implement with something like SemGrep right now, or maybe it's because like there's two different approaches. The rules are doing source to sync trace. Like these tools have been around for a long time. They take longer to run. But if you are consistent in what you're applying and you've taken the time to tune that tool, I wouldn't throw it away just because something else is faster. So I think what I want to get across is I don't want folks to go into these new sort of DevSecOps-y fast tools with the idea that this is going to be the the greatest thing in the world if they've spent any time at all gaining consistency and repeatability out of their existing tool set. So I think it's important to understand, one, like how fast is your engineering team moving? Two, is the process that you're going to develop something that you can make consistent with your existing tool set? And if so, and you can't integrate it, then I think that you can gain that same speed without going through all of the headache of onboarding a new tool. I think that consistency is like much, much more important to me to establish in terms of being able to run it in a consistent manner, where you're not just handling false positives all the time. Like that needs to be in place. So if SemGrep makes that easier for you, great, use it. If it's the same problem, the tool's not going to solve everything for you.
Yeah. I'd say one other factor that plays into this too is how fast you can iterate and fix things. So like if every scan gives a developer 100 things that they have to either determine is a false positive or fix, and then they determine something is a false positive, and then they have to go through like an exception process to get it like marked, and that takes like weeks. I mean, one of the things, these guys were so ahead of their time, but one of the things that the Twitter guys on the AppSec side talked about was they had Brakeman running, and developers would get an email saying, hey, you introduced a bug. It sent them an email, and in the email there was a big button that said like bullshit, basically. Like, I think this is a false positive. It would flag the finding, the AppSec team had to jump on it, validate if it was a real finding or not, and then they'd proceed that way. But like, if you can't quickly iterate through and improve the tool, and I don't think security can do this on their own, because if you have hundreds of code bases or thousands of code bases, like you're not going to be able to do this over and over again. So you have to have help tuning these things, and being able to iterate through those quickly is very important. So I think that's another facet of how you implement any tool, no matter what, AppSec or CloudSec or whatever.
No, totally agree. I like that approach too. And I think that if I'm thinking about it, it's really working through automation of notifying engineers and folks that you are trying to get help with, and you're working to make that tool more consistent, right? Because what you're doing is if I hear you correctly, it's kind of like crowdsourced a quality check, which allows you to make the tool more consistent so that it can be faster and more accurate, which goes back to those things. Like that is, so maybe another way to think about this is you can introduce some automation that will help to facilitate some of the pillars of this, which is that repeatability and that consistency.
Yeah, for sure. You have to automate your automation. I mean,
I guess.
Yeah. We've talked about self-service before, and it kind of fits into that. Like, offer the services to people and have those well-oiled kind of processes and technologies that help support them, so that people know what to do when they get a false positive, and it doesn't get lost in an email chain, things like that.
Yeah. And don't just like sort of focus on one element of automation. The remediation, the addressing the item, the change management, all that stuff can be automated as well. Yeah. So I think we spent a lot of time on SAST and scanning, and I think it's an easy thing to sort of poke holes in.
It's the topic that will never die in AppSec.
Yeah, because I think everybody is having a hard time in some way with scanning. I have a list of like 9 or 10 things. We're about 20 minutes in here. I do want to say I want to address the next element of scanning, which is dynamic scanning, DAST. So against the live application. Is this something you think is even possible to automate, or is it worth automating?
I'll give you my hot take, and then you get to agree or disagree on this. I think if you have a well-oiled SAST program, like we just talked about, so the right tool for your code base, it's well-tuned, quick iteration, you don't need a traditional DAST solution, especially not in the pipeline. That's my tepid hot take. Not very hot, but
Yeah, you're on sort of the DAST is dead train a little bit.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
You're sort of at the station.
Sounds like. I could be brought back. I could be convinced, but I haven't heard of a huge amount of DAST in the pipeline success stories in quite a while. So
Yeah, I would say I agree with you in that I haven't heard a lot of success stories. But it would be interesting to take it through the process, right? So why does it fail, in your opinion? And I can give you my opinion. So in those
just
three
keep
elements,
kicking it back to me. Keep kicking it back to me.
yeah, I'm doing it.
Put me on the hot seat. I mean, I think it fails because DAS tools don't generally have. I mean, traditionally they have not handled things like authentication or workflows very well. And I think that's even more true now that everything is, not everything, but a lot of things are an API with just a JavaScript single page application, and everything's just dynamically loaded. So I think they've just struggled to move into that. They struggled with traditional apps, and now they've struggled even more with SPAs. And I know they're kind of SPA native tools that are meant to be able to figure out the routes and be able to figure out how to work with the API endpoints. But I mean, yeah, I just haven't seen from a DAS tool an amazing like logic bug versus what you'd see from like a really good pen tester or bug bounty. So that's why I feel like it's. I'll let you respond, and I have one positive idea about DAS, but in general, I think just like the wide berth scanning that we've traditionally done with it is kind of outmoded.
Yeah, no, I mean I don't disagree. I'm trying to line it up in my head in the sense that you described a couple of things. One is that it doesn't log in very well. It has trouble getting tokens. It's on an SPA, it may or may not crawl all the pages. APIs, you need the whole the swagger or whatever. It's like not great at crawling anymore. And I think that by nature, that is not a consistent process, right? Because it's like every single time you're kind of you're asking a tool to guess and try to figure out the structure of an application and then go automatically run payloads against it. Now, I think that you could potentially like maybe instead do like fuzzing or something. Like I mean, I don't know. It's just not you're not expecting a consistent result. You're actually looking for things that are inconsistent. So I think that as a result, I don't think it's a great candidate for automation. You can do it, but it would be. I don't think that the result that we expect out of it, which is a list of vulnerabilities, is going to be an effective and consistent thing. And so I think that if you are going to automate it, it probably shouldn't be first on your list. I think there's probably some way to do it where you could make elements of it consistent and precise, where you test a specific endpoint, or you are providing it with like as part of the build process, we regenerate, a Swagger file, and we provide it to the DAS tool. The DAS tool runs the endpoints and looks for specific types of attacks that we are worried about. I think that'd be a good candidate for automation. But is that going to be as effective as like SAST or a pen test or some of the other things that we would talk about, threat modeling, security requirements, things of that nature? I think that we used to put sort of you want SAST and DAST side by side, and now I'm sort of like you should still continue to do SAST. I think DAST is like something I'd probably come back to and revisit later.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. I mean, I think there's some things. I think DAST can be a good regression tool. We both know a company that had there been a regression to test if everyone was logging in as one of the founders of the company, then they would have known about a security incident way sooner. So I think that there are things like that, almost kind of like what we have with is it up or down? Like the website, the outage testing websites. If you had something to test, even if it's not completely end-to-end, test your authentication systems. Make sure you can't just bypass authentication on certain pages. Make sure everyone isn't shown the admin page, something like that. Like I think there's some higher fidelity tests you can do with DAST, but yeah, kind of doing the click a button and just fire it away at apps. I think that's kind of we have to move past that. It's just not. you're going to get some stuff, but you're going to spend a huge amount of time trying to figure out what's legit and what's not.
Right. And I think it becomes almost like security UX UI. In my head, I'm thinking a good case might be, well, we know, like if we're generating a session token, maybe we have to go through like 5 apps, a couple of databases to like get that session token back. And we want to check that it goes end to end. And like what I send in, I get the expected result back, something like that, or like a particular format, or it doesn't have a particular whatever. I think that might be an interesting case, but again, that's a specific test. It's, like you said, high fidelity test, something that we know is going to be good. It's not like what we traditionally think of as DAST, which is crawling, exploring, and sort of pseudo fuzzing tools.
Yeah.
So DAST is dying or partially dead or has some growing up to do.
We're never going to get any sponsors for this podcast, basically, based on just crapping on every major.
Unless they line up with this stuff. Well, I mean, I don't know. I think it's important that we know that vendors like really are going after the buzzword stuff, and I think that they do solve the issues, but I think that just like any marketing or sales, it's everything is sold as kind of an easy button. And I think that the same problems still exist in all these tools. It's just that, we're working in sort of a different scenario, but you still have to put work in. Right.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next line item, which is something that I hear debates on all the time in terms of can we automate this thing or what's the best path to automate it? And that is threat modeling. So you can ask me questions about this if you want, but that's the next sort of path in. Threat modeling, yes or no, inside of DevSecOps security automation.
I mean, I'll definitely rely on you more because you've done more of this in general. But I mean, maybe if the output you get from it is very actionable by the right people. Or if you just want a catalog of threat models of all your apps or cloud architectures, that's my gut feeling. What are your thoughts?
way to turn it over.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a couple. I think when people think about threat modeling, security automation, and threat modeling, I think that they have this idea that you're gonna put in components and connections, and it's going to draw a diagram for you, and it's going to generate all the threats, and it's going to tell you what to do, and there's like this pipe dream of like automated threat modeling. And so I think that when you have that in mind, it's like that's it. I think folks say that's impossible, and I think threat modelers might say that it's impossible because you need the collaboration of other people to do effective threat modeling. Like really effective threat models are in the room with each other. And I think that you also get some feedback that it's impossible because it's like there's so much that goes into it. You're going to end up with this like really kludgy mess of a threat model and a diagram. And to me, I think threat modeling, the output is like the remediation, and in some cases, especially if you're doing it early and not after the fact, it's the requirement that you're putting in for a control. Like that is the action item that you're taking away from a threat model in my eyes. The exercise is great to like talk to people and try to get these ideas out and think about new ways of how to look at an application. But that's kind of how I look at it. So if I sort of put this in my head of, is it precise? Is it consistent? Is it repeatable? I think that the process is repeatable, right? I think that getting questions answered and diving in and having some information discovery, I think that process is repeatable. I think to make it consistent, we would probably have a prescriptive list of things that we expect to cover in the model. And if I think about how it is precise, I think that it is that we are going to have a specific output, which is that requirement. And so in that sense, I think that my favorite idea for automation and threat modeling right now is that is going to be the easiest for people to pick up is like the questionnaire based stuff. So I think SD Elements does something like that where it's like a questionnaire based threat model. It's almost like a risk assessment, but I think that there's a very consistent thing that you can place into a process for a new application that folks can fill out that will give you a baseline model with which to act on, and it can give you some basic requirements, almost to help you design secure patterns or fall into secure patterns. Is it a complete threat model? No. In the same way that if we talk about SaaS, like we're not looking for the comprehensive scan, we're looking to sort of build onto that. But I do think that it's possible in that respect. And I've also seen some folks attempt in the infrastructure as code world to take input from CloudFormation and Terraform plans, which are consistently designed, plans, for lack of a better word, for infrastructure that give you very precise and specific parameters that you could potentially build a threat model on. And I think Threat Modeler does that for Terraform, and they do it for CloudFormation, or maybe it's just CloudFormation actually, where you can import the template and then it will provide you with a list of potential threats. That being said, I think it has the potential to go down the path of like automating the big SaaS scan or having too many results or being in that false positive sort of vulnerability management type of area. But I don't think it's impossible. And I think that as long as you kind of stick to those three things, that either of those approaches could work. And I think that the most approachable is probably the questionnaire-based thing.
Yeah. You make me think of a couple of different things, but I mean, I think one of the biggest values from doing threat modeling is the fact that you have, even if it's only an hour, you have a security person or more, and you have the dev team or DevOps team, whatever technical team you're working with, and you're sitting there hashing out, okay, how does this thing work? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And I find it's almost like a really good training, like a security mindset training, to basically shift devs into thinking about how can someone break their system. And I think I would say you most likely lose most of that doing automated threat modeling, but I mean, that's kind of a question to you from what you've seen from people who have done automated threat modeling. Have you seen kind of that almost training and mindset piece kind of go along with those tools, or is it more just been a paper exercise that people take away, like, okay, great, I got to fix these three things?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I do think it becomes more of a paper exercise. I think that, it only works if you have, like, the way that I look at it is that we're not trying to automate everything that doesn't fit into automation. And I think that we sort of swipe it with too broad of a brush. But just like you were talking about, automating the feedback form for false positives, or you can automate portions of these processes. I don't know how to pronounce words anymore. My wife's English, and I get all wound up. But it's like, how do you automate, or in the spirit of scaling, how do you automate the pieces of the job that are precise, consistent, and repeatable, and make that a portion to scale so that you can focus again on the critical thinking and the problem solving. So I think the training bit of threat modeling and going through the in the room whiteboarding, that this type of process can help you get a jump start on that, so you're not starting from scratch, right? It can ask people the question that you always ask, because you're always in there doing the information discovery session. Even if you start an AppSec assessment, you're like, what kind of database are you using? How many VPCs do you have? Is it multi-region? All these things that you can work through can be answered because they're things that you ask all the time. And you probably, if you're doing threat modeling, you probably have a list of places that you start so that you can get folks thinking about it in the right way. And I think that seed can be automated right now.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Get the low hanging fruit at least, and probably some of the non low hanging fruit out of the way, and then you can have a more fruitful, to continue using that word, conversation with your team, or at least you have something on paper that feeds into your kind of overall risk profile of an app. One other thought from what you said before, talking about threat modeling, infrastructure as code. Here's I kind of get that idea because I mean I've talked about this a lot. Infrastructure as code is very specific. Like there is an API to there's a way you write Terraform, and yeah, you can have modules, there's some logic you can build in, so it's like less specific. But in general, there's a resource, there's parameters on that resource, and there's certain values expected for those parameters on that resource. So it's relatively easy to reason about what is going to come out the other end. So yeah, you build like a really beautiful threat model of an application that's using like a typical application stack, and then you have all these threats. It's like, okay, that's great. So you're telling the team, don't do these things or figure out what your protections for those things are. Why not just, instead of doing any of that for your infrastructure as code, just write tests so that they can't possibly do those things? So like use an S3 bucket. A threat could be a public S3 bucket, and here's the remediation you need. How about you just don't let any public S3 buckets out the door unless there's specific criteria? That's my one thought about like sometimes it feels like you're not you, but people slap on like let's threat model everything versus like just fix the freaking thing. Don't even let it become a potential to be a vulnerability. Just don't let it happen.
Well, I think so. I agree. I think the way that I look at that scenario, though, is that the threat model is what gets you to the fact that you want a test that is stopping the public S3 bucket. Because, to me, it would sort of go through this flow where it's like, in the requirements, you're saying, is this a public-facing web application? Or if somebody's putting a website together, is this an S3 website? Because there are explicit reasons to have public S3 buckets or public, sites, especially folks that are running their sort of static pages in S3 or something along those lines, or maybe they want it public for whatever reason. There's a use case. There's probably going to be some questions that you can put in there that can help you figure out whether or not that policy applies. So the threat model to me is basically helping to create that pattern that you are describing, you're writing a test against to prevent the threat from becoming a vulnerability. Right? So I do agree. It's like, but I don't think that it's like one or the other. It's kind of like you're jumping to that because you're like, I don't want any S3 buckets, but in sort of more nuanced, what ports are available or not. Your tests are going to be different. So your threat model for one, where it's like, you're blocking SSH or you're blocking port 8000 or blocking port 3000. When do those become relevant and what patterns? And so I think that's where the threat modeling bit comes in. So I think that you could automate a little bit of that because you can ask questions like, what database are you using? Pick from these three. You got Postgres, you got Mongo, you've got MySQL. They pick one, and now that sort of says, okay, well, here's your model. These are the risks. If somebody goes at you from this port and you have this security group attached, then that's a problem. That's where the test comes in. So I think there's a flow there, in the automation.
Yeah, I usually think of things as like paved paths of like, if you want to use the service, use it in the secure way. I do think one other way threat models could be useful on the infrastructure side is when the relationships get more confusing. So like this has access to that and that has access to this, and thinking through the abuse cases for how entire systems work together, and having a threat model based on your infrastructure as code would be useful there, just to like have that conversation. But just the examples I've seen have just been very dumb, to be honest. Like, oh, your S3 bucket's not encrypted. Okay, just make the Terraform template always be encrypted. Make the CloudFormation always be encrypted. It's like, that the easy stuff is just stupid. Just solve that at the root, and then yeah, you can use threat modeling to figure out the more complex way that systems could break or be exploited. But
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from. It's like just short circuit the whole should we do this or not and make it the paved path. Um, but I think it's always, when I'm doing threat modeling, I think we're always developing some, especially in these areas where these requirements systems aren't built out. We're creating this register of threats so that folks always have it on their mind because they don't have someone like yourself that's constantly thinking about that volume should be encrypted, that volume should be encrypted, that volume should be encrypted, and there is no paved path. And so you could write the policy to say, detect before you deploy the infrastructure whether or not the EBS volume is encrypted. But I think that the questionnaire always raises the awareness of it so that the diagram that folks reference in the human readable format shows that the EBS volume should be encrypted, or shows that that is a threat and that there is a control that we expect to have there. So I think one facilitates the other, which is why I think that I like thinking of threat modeling output as requirements, as opposed to, like, the threats are definitely there, but I try to think always in action-oriented results or action-oriented outputs, and the threat isn't really action-oriented. It's a element of fear. It tells you what's wrong. It says what could happen, but what is the action for the engineer or for the infrastructure team? It's to find a control to prevent that threat, and that control is a requirement, and that requirement should be tested. So if I think about the threat modeling output as a requirement, then it helps me be like, okay, I know that the EBS volume should be encrypted. I know that I should only have X, Y, and Z ports open. I know that it needs to be in multi-region VPC. I know that MFA needs to be enabled. Mm-hmm. That kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense. I'm just always especially when you can be prescriptive, when we're not talking about false positives. I'm always about just being prescriptive. But yeah.
All right. Well, that's threat modeling.
Yeah.
I think we have, I know this is a long episode. We can go over the 60-minute mark, but I think we can keep the energy up if we still have people listening right now. And that is the last bit of what we think about in automation for DevSecOps. And I think this is your favorite one. I think this is your favorite.
I sense sarcasm.
Many favorites. And that's automatic remediation.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah.
You got me back in. I was fading. I'm back in.
Oh, you're in. Yeah. So I don't know that I've ever seen this work well. So I'm gonna defer to you and ask you, have you seen this work well? Where do you see failures? Have you seen any successes? What do you even mean by automatic remediation?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll start with, I think on the AppSec side, I have not seen it done successfully. Now there's WAFs and there's, what did they call it? What did the WAFs call it? It was like auto healing or something like that, where like the code underneath is still vulnerable, but we have a new rule set that basically acts like it's patched. Okay. Makes me want to puke a little bit. But anyway, I haven't seen I have not seen like auto patching of code. I think that'd be pretty scary. I do think we see things like GitHub Dependabot, which actually don't fix code, but they update your dependencies a lot, and you just can click go and update your dependencies. So I think that's pretty handy. I haven't seen it done on the code side. On the cloud infrastructure side, I have seen it actually done really well. Capital One created a tool called Cloud Custodian, which is a rule set driven tool that basically just watches any resources that are created or updated in your environment and just can do different things. It can warn about them. It can just tear them down. And it's a super powerful tool that you can basically prevent people from creating insecure configurations. And it'll tear it down if you do create something. So like when I work there, if if you created an EBS volume that was unencrypted, basically it was gone by the time you refresh the page. So a really, really effective way to prevent certain misconfigurations. So I do think it can work in that world where, again, you have a prescriptive specification for what something should be. You have an EBS volume. If volume is unencrypted, destroy volume. Like simple logic. So I think that's a very easy world to operate in. It gets more difficult in the code space just because code is just more complex and it's not as it's not as specific as infrastructure as code or cloud configurations are. So so I think it definitely can be effective there. I think people are very timid about doing this. Even the vendors don't talk a huge amount about auto remediation. Some of them have kind of dipped their toe in it, but I don't know. I'd be surprised if many of them sell that piece of their tool. They're mostly still on the detect and alert side of things.
Yeah, and I think, I'm with you. This is why I don't think it works well in AppSec and I think that you can do some of the auto remediation in infrastructure as code, but I think that that's sort of become its own industry with SOAR, right? And sort of automation in that side. And it's almost become like this infrastructure thing. And I think it works, like you said, because we have this very specific way to interact with cloud resources in all of the cloud service providers through a CLI or through an API, basically. We have structured output that we understand exactly how things are played out, and we can write rules against that. I think automatic remediation is theoretically possible in apps, but I think that it requires something that I always suggest to folks, but I don't know is really done a lot. Like I've seen a couple of things done, but in very small, like specific and small cases, almost as trials. I don't know that I've seen it done at scale. And that is like, if you have a particular type of vulnerability, let's just take cross-site scripting, and you know that you want to do validation and escaping. If you have a framework that does this in a specific way, you could theoretically detect for the absence of a control in a specific scenario and remediate by implementing that control, as opposed to looking from source to sink and figuring out whether or not a vulnerability exists. And I just think that even in those cases, you're going to have edge cases where it doesn't work, or it can't be applied in that specific way, or you couldn't detect all the validation. So I think that it just becomes very difficult because it's also nuanced and you have coding styles and things like that. So you'd have to have a very strong coding guide, which is going to limit your developer creativity, which is, probably won't have a lot of engineers that way. And you'd have to have a very specific remediation for a very specific issue. And I think that you said it kind of comes down to configurations. You could probably test for, like particular configurations in like the POM or something, or like environment variables or secrets. Yeah. You could say like if it detects any secrets, you could be using truffle hog or something. If you detect any, private certificates, you can, destroy the certificate or something. Or auto rotate it or something like that. But I just in terms of manipulating the code, I think you're right. I don't think we're there yet.
It reminded me of Microsoft recently had the issue where, speaking of England, they had the UK English. They had changed zip code to postal code, and someone did a find and replace on the Windows source code. It basically replaced zip to postal code, and so now if you right click on a file on certain versions of Windows, it says compress as postal file because they just did that. So this is why we can't have auto remediation, because we can't even get this right.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like it's so contextual, and even in case like you have to be very specific in terms of how you identify something and very specific on how you fix it. I think that's the hard part when it comes to code and even configurations. So I think, we'll maybe with the AI stuff we get there. I don't think it's there yet, but Yeah, I don't really like the auto remediation in those cases. I think there are some cases, right? But I think that you really have to have it's basically, again, anything that is consistent and structured, you could probably write an auto remediation for.
Yeah. I would love to be proven wrong, and I'd love to see some examples of this being done and done well. So if anyone has any of those examples, definitely share it with us. But
Yeah, please, that'd be amazing. But yeah, like you said, I haven't seen it myself. But I think we have others to go through, but we're breaking all of our rules in this episode because we're very excited about automation and DevSecOps. It's a hot topic, something everyone thinks about. But we did have detection, we had dependencies, we had security integration testing, IAM automation, things that you'll have to tune in to another episode to figure out and listen to us talk about if you're even interested. But for those that made it this far, thank you very much for listening to this episode of automation. If you want to get a hold of Mike or myself, you can reach us at security@r2dso.com. You can also hit us up on Twitter at r2dso, or just send us a comment, or reach out on LinkedIn or wherever you find our lovely faces and voices. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.